It was a chilly Monday morning in October when Judge Robert Thompson left his house in a hurry. He had overslept slightly, something that rarely happened to him in his 15 years on the bench. The respected 58-year-old judge had a full docket waiting at the county courthouse, and he disliked being anything but perfectly punctual. The judge's dark blue sedan moved smoothly through the quiet suburban streets. His neighborhood was just waking up, people collecting newspapers from driveways, dog walkers bundled against the morning chill, and children waiting at bus stops. He nodded politely to his neighbors as he passed, his mind already running through the cases he would hear today. Judge Thompson had earned his position through decades of hard work. Growing up in a working-class family, he had put himself through college and law school, eventually becoming one of the most respected judges in the county. His reputation for fairness and impartiality was well known, and attorneys often commented on his ability to see through arguments to the heart of a case. The judge checked his watch. He still had time, but he would need to take the highway instead of his usual route. He signaled and merged onto the on-ramp, accelerating perhaps a bit more quickly than usual. Officer Michael Reynolds was parked in his usual spot, partially hidden by the shadow of the overpass. His shift had started at 6 a.m., and so far, it had been quiet. The 32-year-old officer had been with the department for 7 years now. Most of his colleagues described him as by the book, sometimes to a fault. Reynolds believed in enforcing the law equally for everyone, no exceptions, no special treatment. His radar gun registered a vehicle going 12 miles over the speed limit. Reynolds immediately turned on his lights and pulled out to follow the dark blue sedan. The car promptly signaled and pulled over to the shoulder, at least the driver was being cooperative. As Reynolds approached the vehicle, he noticed the driver was a well-dressed older black man in a suit. The officer's face remained neutral as he reached the driver's window. "Good morning, sir." "License and registration, please," Officer Reynolds said, his tone professional. "Good morning, officer," the judge replied, reaching for his wallet. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" "You were traveling at 67 in a 55 zone, sir," Reynolds replied. "I'll need to see your license and registration." Judge Thompson handed over his documents. "I apologize for the speed. I'm running a bit late for court this morning." Officer Reynolds took the documents and returned to his patrol car to process them. When he ran the license, his eyebrows raised slightly at the name and occupation that appeared on his screen. Judge Robert Thompson, County Circuit Court. Reynolds paused for a moment, then continued writing the ticket. When he returned to the judge's car, Reynolds handed back the license and registration along with a speeding ticket. "Here you are, sir. This is a citation for exceeding the posted speed limit. You have the option to pay the fine or contest it in court within 30 days. Judge Thompson looked at the ticket, then back at the officer with a slight smile. "Thank you, officer. I'll take care of this." "Drive safely, sir," Reynolds said, tipping his hat slightly before returning to his patrol car. What neither of them knew was that this routine traffic stop would set in motion a series of events that would reverberate through the courthouse and beyond. Later that morning, Judge Thompson arrived at the courthouse, nodding to the security guards as he passed through the metal detectors. The building was already bustling with attorneys, defendants, plaintiffs, and courthouse staff. He made his way to his chambers, where his clerk was waiting with the day's files. "Good morning, Your Honor," his clerk said. "Everything's ready for you. First case is at 9:30. "Thank you," the judge replied, hanging up his coat. "By the way, I was issued a speeding ticket this morning. Please add a note to my calendar to take care of it during lunch." His clerk looked surprised. "A ticket? Would you like me to make some calls? I'm sure it could be handled." "No," Judge Thompson interrupted firmly. "It will be handled like any other ticket. I was speeding, and the officer was doing his job." The clerk nodded and left to prepare the courtroom. Judge Thompson sat at his desk, reviewing his notes for the first case. He believed deeply in the principle that no one was above the law, including himself. At 9:30 sharp, Judge Thompson entered the courtroom. "All rise," called the bailiff, and everyone stood as the judge took his seat at the bench. "Be seated," he said, and looked down at the day's docket. His eyes widened slightly, then his expression returned to its usual professional calm. The first case of the day was a routine traffic violation hearing. And the officer scheduled to testify was none other than Officer Michael Reynolds. As the defendants and their attorneys filled the rows, Officer Reynolds entered the courtroom in his crisp uniform. He took his usual seat near the front, ready to testify about the various citations he had issued. When he glanced toward the bench, he froze momentarily as he recognized Judge Thompson. The judge met his gaze with a slight nod but gave no other indication that they had met earlier that morning. The bailiff called the first case, and a young man approached the podium with his attorney. The charge was speeding, 15 miles over the limit. "Officer Reynolds," Judge Thompson said evenly, "please present your testimony." Reynolds stood and approached the witness stand. He recounted the details of the traffic stop professionally, answering questions from both the prosecutor and defense attorney with clarity and precision. When it came time for the judge to make his ruling, Thompson looked at the young defendant thoughtfully. "The evidence presented by Officer Reynolds is clear and compelling. The court finds you guilty of exceeding the posted speed limit," he pronounced. As the morning progressed through several more cases, those in the courtroom began to notice something unusual. Each time Officer Reynolds testified, Judge Thompson listened carefully and ruled strictly according to the law and evidence presented, nothing more, nothing less. There was no hint of resentment or favoritism in any direction. During a brief recess, whispers began circulating among the courthouse staff. Someone had seen the judge's car being pulled over that morning. Word spread quickly that Judge Thompson himself had received a ticket from Officer Reynolds, the very same officer now appearing in his courtroom. By lunchtime, the courthouse was buzzing with speculation. How would the judge handle this unusual situation? Would there be tension? Favoritism? Retaliation? During the lunch break, Judge Thompson sat alone in his chambers, reviewing case files while eating a sandwich he'd brought from home. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The court administrator, Mrs. Wilson, entered with a concerned expression. "Judge Thompson, I've been hearing some talk around the courthouse about you and Officer Reynolds. Is everything all right?" The judge set down his papers and smiled slightly. "I see news travels fast. Yes, everything is fine. Officer Reynolds pulled me over this morning for speeding, which I was. He gave me a ticket, as he should have." Mrs. Wilson looked relieved but puzzled. "And you're hearing his cases today?" "Of course. Why wouldn't I? He was doing his job, and now I'm doing mine." After Mrs. Wilson left, Judge Thompson sat back in his chair, reflecting on the situation. Throughout his career, he had witnessed countless examples of how people in positions of power expected special treatment. As one of the few black judges in the county, he had worked twice as hard to build a reputation for fairness and integrity. A speeding ticket wouldn't change that. Meanwhile, in the courthouse cafeteria, Officer Reynolds sat with several other officers who were scheduled to testify that afternoon. "So you actually ticketed Judge Thompson this morning?" one of them asked incredulously. "Man, I would have just given him a warning. You know how judges can be." Reynolds shook his head. "The law is the law. He was speeding." "Well, good luck in his courtroom this afternoon," another officer laughed. "Hope you don't have any cases you care about winning." Reynolds frowned but said nothing. He had noticed how professionally Judge Thompson had treated him during the morning session. There had been no hint of resentment or bias in any of his rulings. When court resumed after lunch, the room was noticeably more crowded. Word had spread about the unusual situation, and several attorneys and courthouse employees had found excuses to observe the proceedings. The afternoon cases proceeded smoothly. Judge Thompson continued to preside with impartiality, carefully considering the evidence in each case. When Officer Reynolds testified, the judge asked appropriate questions and made fair rulings based solely on the facts presented. During the last case of the day, a defense attorney attempted to subtly discredit Officer Reynolds' testimony by implying he might be overzealous in his enforcement. "Officer Reynolds," the attorney asked with a smirk, "would you say you ticket everyone equally, regardless of their position in the community?" Before Reynolds could answer, Judge Thompson intervened. "Counselor, that line of questioning is irrelevant to the case at hand. Please stick to the facts of your client's situation." The attorney looked chastened. "Yes, Your Honor." No further questions. As the court session ended, Judge Thompson made an unexpected announcement. "Before we adjourn, I'd like to address something. It has come to my attention that there has been discussion regarding a traffic stop involving myself and Officer Reynolds this morning." The courtroom fell silent. "I want to make it clear that Officer Reynolds was doing his job professionally and correctly. I was exceeding the speed limit, and he issued a citation as he should have. No one is above the law in this county, including me." With that statement, Judge Thompson adjourned court for the day. As people filed out, the conversations were no longer about potential conflict between the judge and the officer, but about something much more surprising, the integrity they had both shown. Officer Reynolds gathered his papers, nodding respectfully to the judge as he prepared to leave. To his surprise, Judge Thompson gestured for him to approach the bench. Officer Reynolds approached the bench, aware that several pairs of eyes were watching this interaction with intense curiosity. "Yes, Your Honor," he asked, his voice professional but uncertain. Judge Thompson spoke quietly, just loud enough for Reynolds to hear. "Officer, I appreciate your professionalism today. It can't have been easy walking into my courtroom after our encounter this morning." Reynolds nodded slightly. "Just doing my job, Your Honor." "Same as you." "Indeed," the judge replied. "I wonder if you might have a moment to speak privately?" "My chambers, perhaps?" Reynolds looked surprised but agreed. "Yes, sir. I can do that." 10 minutes later, Officer Reynolds sat across from Judge Thompson in the judge's chambers. The room was impressive yet comfortable, with law books lining the walls and framed photographs showing the judge at various community events. "Coffee?" Judge Thompson offered, gesturing to the small pot on a side table. "No thank you, sir," Reynolds replied, still wondering why he had been invited for this private conversation. The judge poured himself a cup and settled back in his chair. "Officer Reynolds, I've been on the bench for 15 years now. In that time, I've seen how people in positions of authority often expect special treatment." Reynolds remained silent, unsure how to respond. "Your colleagues would have likely looked the other way this morning when they saw my credentials," the judge continued. "Many officers do. But you didn't." "The law applies to everyone, sir," Reynolds said simply. Judge Thompson nodded, a slight smile appearing. "That's exactly right. And that principle is the foundation of our entire justice system. Yet too often, it's compromised by bias, favoritism, or fear." He took a sip of his coffee before continuing. "You know, there's a program I've been trying to get off the ground for some time now. A community initiative to build better understanding between law enforcement and the public, particularly in underserved neighborhoods." Officer Reynolds leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "We need officers involved who truly believe in equal application of the law," the judge explained. "Officers who show integrity even when it would be easier not to. I think you might be a good fit." Reynolds looked thoughtful. "What exactly would this program involve, sir?" "Community forums, ride-along programs, youth mentorship. The goal is to break down barriers, build trust, and create meaningful dialogue. We need representatives from the bench and from law enforcement who can demonstrate what integrity looks like in action. As Judge Thompson outlined his vision, Officer Reynolds realized this wasn't what he had expected at all. He had walked into the judge's chambers prepared for a reprimand or an uncomfortable conversation. Instead, he was being offered an opportunity. "I'd need to discuss it with my sergeant," Reynolds said cautiously. "But it sounds like something I'd be interested in." "Excellent," the judge replied. "I'll send over the information. The first planning meeting is next week." As their conversation concluded, Reynolds stood to leave. At the door, he paused and turned back. "Your Honor, may I ask a question?" "Of course. This program you mentioned, is this why you called me in? Or was there something else?" Judge Thompson smiled. "Partly that. But also because I wanted to thank you personally." "Thank me? For giving you a ticket?" Reynolds asked, confusion evident in his expression. "For treating me like any other citizen," the judge clarified. "Do you know how rarely that happens once people see the title, Judge, before my name?" It was refreshing. As Officer Reynolds left the chambers, neither man realized that their small interaction, a routine traffic stop and its aftermath, was already beginning to ripple through the courthouse and beyond in ways they couldn't have anticipated. The next morning, local news reporter Diane Chen was scrolling through social media during her coffee break when a post caught her attention. Someone who worked at the courthouse had shared a vague but intriguing story about a judge and police officer. Sensing a potential human interest piece, she decided to investigate. By noon, Diane had pieced together enough information to know she was onto something special. She made calls to her contacts at both the courthouse and police department, trying to arrange interviews with Judge Thompson and Officer Reynolds. Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Reynolds was completing paperwork when his sergeant approached. "Reynolds, got a minute?" Sergeant Bailey asked, gesturing toward his office. Once inside, the sergeant closed the door. "So, I got a call from Judge Thompson this morning about some community program he wants you involved in. Want to tell me what that's about?" Officer Reynolds explained the conversation from the previous day. The sergeant leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. "Let me get this straight. You ticketed one of the most respected judges in the county, then ended up in his courtroom, and instead of making your life difficult, he invited you to join his community initiative?" "That's about it, sir," Reynolds replied. "Huh." The sergeant scratched his chin. "You know, we've been looking for ways to improve community relations. This could be good for the department." Across town, Judge Thompson was having lunch with the chief judge of the county, an old friend who had heard rumors about yesterday's events. "So Robert, I hear you've caused quite a stir," the chief judge said with an amused smile. Judge Thompson chuckled. "News travels fast around here." "Faster than you were driving, apparently," his friend joked. "But seriously, people are talking about how you handled it." Some of the other judges were quite impressed. It wasn't about making an impression, Thompson insisted. It was just the right thing to do. Either way, it's having an effect. Judge Harrison actually dismissed his parking ticket yesterday, said he was inspired by your example. Judge Thompson frowned. "That's not exactly the message I was hoping to send." By the end of the day, both Judge Thompson and Officer Reynolds had received multiple interview requests from local media. Neither had responded yet, both uncomfortable with the attention their simple interaction had generated. What they didn't realize was that a security camera near the highway had captured their morning traffic stop. The footage showed the respectful interaction between the black judge and the white officer, a routine traffic stop handled with mutual professionalism by both men. When Diane Chen obtained this footage through a public records request, she knew she had the centerpiece for her story, a story that would soon reach far beyond the courthouse walls. That evening, Officer Reynolds received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end introduced himself as the police chief. "Reynolds," the chief said, "I think we need to talk about what's happening with you and Judge Thompson. This thing is starting to get bigger than either of you probably expected." Officer Reynolds sat in the police chief's office early the next morning, uncomfortable with the attention he was receiving. Across from him, Chief Thomas reviewed the footage of the traffic stop on his computer. "Clean stop, by the book," the chief commented, looking up at Reynolds. "But that's not why we're here." He turned his monitor around to show Reynolds a local news website. The headline read, "Justice Served, When Law Enforcement and the Judiciary Show True Equality." "Reporter named Diane Chen has been calling all morning," the chief explained. "Stories getting traction." The mayor's office called too. Reynolds shifted in his seat. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "I know," Chief Thomas nodded. "That's exactly why this is getting attention. In today's climate, people are hungry for positive examples of law enforcement treating everyone equally, regardless of race or position." Meanwhile, Judge Thompson was meeting with court officials about the sudden publicity. The court administrator looked concerned. "Judge, we've received requests for statements from 3 news outlets already. How would you like to proceed?" Thompson sighed. "I'd prefer to decline comment. This wasn't about publicity." "With respect, sir," the administrator replied, "this story is already out there. If you don't provide context, others will fill in the blanks with their own interpretations." Across town, Diane Chen was interviewing a courthouse clerk who had witnessed the interaction between the judge and officer in court. "It was remarkable," the clerk said. "No tension, no favoritism, just 2 professionals doing their jobs with integrity. In my 20 years working here, I've never seen anything like it." "What made it so unusual?" Diane asked. The clerk thought for a moment. In a system where connections and status often influence outcomes, seeing someone with Judge Thompson's authority treated like any other citizen, and then watching him embrace that equal treatment rather than resent it, was powerful. By midday, Judge Thompson reluctantly agreed to a joint interview with Officer Reynolds, on the condition that the focus remain on their community initiative rather than the traffic stop. When they met at the courthouse to prepare, both men seemed uncomfortable with their newfound attention. "Never thought giving a speeding ticket would lead to all this," Reynolds said with a slight smile. "Nor did I expect receiving one would do the same," Thompson replied. "But perhaps there's opportunity here." "For your community program?" "Yes. Sometimes the right message needs the right moment to be heard." As they discussed their approach to the interview, Judge Thompson's clerk interrupted with an urgent message. The state's attorney general was on the phone, wanting to speak with both of them immediately. "The attorney general?" Reynolds asked, surprised. Judge Thompson looked equally puzzled as he picked up the phone and put it on speaker. Judge Thompson speaking, with Officer Reynolds present. "Gentlemen," came the attorney general's voice, "I've been following your story with great interest. What began as a routine traffic stop has highlighted something we desperately need in our justice system right now. I have a proposal for both of you that I think could have significant impact across the state." Officer Reynolds and Judge Thompson exchanged glances, neither having anticipated that their simple interaction would reach such high levels of government, or that it might lead to something that could affect the entire state. The Attorney General's proposal was bold. He wanted Judge Thompson and Officer Reynolds to lead a statewide initiative on equal justice and community policing. The program would bring together judges, law enforcement officers, and community members from across the state to develop new approaches to building trust and ensuring fair treatment for all citizens. "Your interaction has highlighted something we've been trying to promote for years," the Attorney General explained. "Equal application of the law, mutual respect between different parts of the justice system, and transparency with the public." After the call ended, both men sat in silence for a moment, processing the magnitude of what had just been proposed. "That's a lot bigger than what I had in mind," Judge Thompson finally said. Officer Reynolds nodded. Yes, sir. I signed up to be a patrol officer, not the face of a statewide program. We don't have to decide immediately, Thompson assured him. But I think we should consider it seriously. That afternoon, Diane Chen's article was published online and immediately began generating buzz. The security camera footage of the traffic stop, showing the respectful interaction between the two men, was viewed thousands of times. Comments poured in, many people expressing how refreshing it was to see a positive story about law enforcement and the courts. By evening, national news outlets had picked up the story. What had started as a routine traffic stop was now being discussed on primetime news shows as an example of what professional integrity looks like in practice. Officer Reynolds' phone rang constantly with calls from fellow officers, friends, and even old academy classmates who had seen the story. At home with his family, he tried to make sense of how quickly everything had changed. "Dad, you're famous," his 10-year-old daughter exclaimed, showing him the story on her tablet. "Not famous," he corrected her gently. "Just doing my job the way it's supposed to be done." Across town, Judge Thompson was having dinner with his wife, who couldn't help but smile at the situation. "For 15 years, I've watched you uphold the law without compromise," she said. "It's about time people noticed." Thompson shook his head. "This shouldn't be newsworthy. It should be normal." "But it isn't," she replied softly. "And that's exactly why it matters." The next morning, Judge Thompson arrived at the courthouse to find a small crowd of people waiting outside. Some held signs with messages like "Equal Justice for All" and "Integrity Matters." When they saw him, they broke into applause. Uncomfortable with the attention but moved by the sentiment, the judge thanked them before hurrying inside. In his chambers, he found a stack of letters that had already arrived, messages from judges, law students, and citizens from across the country who had been inspired by his story. One letter in particular caught his attention. It was from a young black law student who wrote, "Seeing someone who looks like me in your position, being treated equally under the law and then responding with such integrity, has renewed my faith in the system I'm training to be part of." Judge Thompson sat back in his chair, realizing that what had started as a simple traffic citation was becoming something much more significant. As the week progressed, Officer Reynolds and Judge Thompson found themselves at the center of a movement they hadn't intended to create. Media requests continued to pour in, and public interest showed no signs of waning. After careful consideration, both men agreed to accept the Attorney General's proposal, but with conditions. They wanted the initiative to focus on practical changes rather than publicity, and they insisted on including community voices from the beginning. "If this is going to mean anything," Judge Thompson explained during their meeting with the Attorney General, "it needs to create real change, not just good headlines." The Attorney General nodded in agreement. "That's precisely why I wanted both of you involved. You've demonstrated integrity in action, not just in words." The first planning meeting for the statewide initiative was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, both men continued their regular duties, though nothing felt quite regular anymore. Officer Reynolds noticed that his fellow officers treated him differently now. Some seemed impressed, others slightly resentful of the attention he was receiving. During a shift change, a veteran officer pulled him aside. "You know, Reynolds, I've been thinking about what you did. It's made me look at how I handle traffic stops when I see certain credentials." Reynolds wasn't sure how to respond. "I just followed procedure." "Yeah," the older officer said, "but how many of us actually do that when we see judge or district attorney on a license? You're making some of us uncomfortable because you're showing us our own bias." At the courthouse, Judge Thompson experienced similar reactions. Some colleagues congratulated him on his handling of the situation, while others seemed to avoid eye contact. Judge Harrison, who had dismissed his own parking ticket, approached Thompson in the judicial dining room. "Robert, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I misunderstood the message of your example. It wasn't about being lenient with ourselves, but about holding ourselves to the same standards we apply to others. Thompson smiled. We're all learning, James. The important thing is that we keep trying to do better. By Friday, the traffic court clerk handed Judge Thompson a receipt for his paid speeding ticket. He thanked her, folded the paper, and placed it in his wallet. That evening, local community leaders gathered at a church near downtown for a town hall meeting. Both Judge Thompson and Officer Reynolds had been invited to speak about the new initiative. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. When the two men entered together, the crowd fell silent, then broke into applause. A local pastor introduced them, saying, "Sometimes, the most powerful examples come not from grand gestures, but from simple moments of truth." We're blessed to have witnessed such a moment in our community. As Judge Thompson approached the microphone, he glanced at Officer Reynolds, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Thank you all for coming," the judge began. "What brings us together tonight started with a speeding ticket. But it's become about something much more important, the promise that justice can truly be blind to status, race, and position." He paused, looking out at the diverse faces in the audience. That promise has often been broken. But together, we have a chance to begin repairing that breach. The town hall meeting lasted for hours as community members shared their experiences with the justice system. Some stories were painful to hear, accounts of unfair treatment, assumptions based on appearance, and different standards of justice depending on one's position or background. Officer Reynolds sat quietly through much of it, listening intently. When it was his turn to speak, he approached the microphone with visible nervousness. "I'm not good at public speaking," he began. "I'm just a patrol officer who tries to do his job right. What happened between Judge Thompson and me wasn't extraordinary from my perspective. It's how things should work every time." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "Hearing your stories tonight has been eye-opening. I can't fix everything wrong with the system, but I can promise you this: every person I encounter on the job will receive the same treatment, regardless of who they are. And I'll encourage my fellow officers to do the same." The crowd responded with warm applause. One elderly woman stood up and said, "Young man, what you're describing isn't simple at all. It's revolutionary." Over the next few weeks, the initiative began taking shape. Judge Thompson and Officer Reynolds met regularly with the Attorney General's team to develop a framework for reform. They insisted on including diverse voices from communities across the state, ensuring the program addressed real needs rather than just making authorities feel good. Their story continued to spread. A national magazine featured them in a cover story titled, "When Justice is Truly Blind." Schools began using their example in civics classes to discuss equal treatment under the law. What moved both men most, however, were the personal stories that reached them. A mother wrote about using their story to teach her children about integrity. A high school student shared how it had inspired him to pursue a career in law. A retired judge admitted it had made him reflect on times he might have shown favoritism. 1 month after the traffic stop, Officer Reynolds was patrolling his usual route when he noticed a car with a broken taillight. He pulled the vehicle over and approached cautiously. The driver, an elderly black man, seemed nervous as he rolled down his window. "Good afternoon, sir," Reynolds said politely. "Did you know you have a broken taillight?" "No, officer, I didn't," the man replied, his hands visibly shaking as he reached for his license and registration. Reynolds noticed the man's anxiety and tried to put him at ease. "No need to worry, sir. This is just a friendly warning. Please get it fixed when you can for your safety." The man looked up in surprise. "You're that officer from the news, aren't you? The one who ticketed the judge?" Reynolds nodded, slightly uncomfortable with being recognized. The elderly man's eyes filled with tears. "My whole life, I've been afraid during traffic stops. Never thought I'd live to see the day when I could feel safe with a police officer. Thank you for that gift. As Reynolds returned to his patrol car, he realized that sometimes the smallest actions could have the deepest impact. 6 months after the traffic stop that changed their lives, Judge Thompson and Officer Reynolds stood together on a stage at the state capitol. Behind them were representatives from police departments, courts, and community organizations from across the state. The Attorney General approached the podium. Today marks the official launch of the Equal Justice Initiative, he announced to the crowd and cameras. What began with a routine traffic stop has evolved into a comprehensive program that will transform how our justice system serves all citizens equally. The program included new training protocols for law enforcement, community oversight committees, judicial accountability measures, and educational outreach. Every element had been shaped by input from those most affected by disparities in the system. After the ceremony, Judge Thompson and Officer Reynolds found a quiet moment away from the crowds. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Reynolds asked, looking out at the Capitol grounds where people were gathering to learn more about the initiative. Thompson shook his head. "Never. But that's how change often happens, not from grand plans, but from small moments of truth." A week later, Judge Thompson presided over his regular court session. As always, he treated each case with careful consideration, regardless of who stood before him. The difference now was that more of his colleagues were doing the same. Officer Reynolds continued his patrol duties, stopping vehicles when necessary and always following proper procedure. More officers in his department had begun to do likewise, recognizing that true respect came not from selective enforcement but from consistent fairness. On the anniversary of their first encounter, the two men met for coffee. They had become unlikely friends, bonded by their shared experience and commitment to improving the system they both served. "I paid my ticket, you know," Judge Thompson mentioned with a smile. "I would expect nothing less, Your Honor," Reynolds replied. As they talked, a young police cadet approached their table nervously. "Excuse me," she said. "We studied your story at the academy. It's why I decided to become an officer. I wanted to thank you both." After she left, the two men sat in thoughtful silence. "One traffic stop," Reynolds finally said. "One moment of doing the right thing," Thompson nodded. "And it keeps rippling outward. Sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the simplest actions, a white officer stopping a black judge, both choosing integrity over expectation, and in doing so, showing what justice could truly look like."